December 6, 1991. Austin, Texas. A quiet Friday night draped in holiday lights. The kind of evening that feels safe until it isn't. In a small strip mall off Anderson Lane, 4 teenage girls, bright, happy, full of promise, are closing up a frozen yogurt shop. By morning, their names will haunt the city. Jennifer's mother, feeling very devastated, says, "She told me she'd be home soon. I fell asleep waiting. The phone rang, and everything after that is a blur." They were daughters, sisters, best friends. And what happened to them inside that shop has never been answered. Not fully, not truthfully. Watch closely, because the suspect everyone ignored was always there. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, both 17, were responsible beyond their years. They were trusted to lock up the yogurt shop that night. Jennifer's 15-year-old sister Sarah came along to keep her company, bringing their 13-year-old friend, Amy Ayers. At 11:03 p.m., Officer Troy Gay drove past the shop on patrol. The doors were locked. Lights dimmed. Nothing out of place. Less than an hour later, flames tore through the night sky. Unit 12 responding to structure fire at Anderson Lane, heavy smoke visible. Firefighters forced entry and rushed inside. What they saw next froze them where they stood. 4 bodies. Bound. Burned. Shot in the head. An archived quote of one of the fire investigator read, "The silence in that room was worse than the flames." The scene looked chaotic, but the brutality was controlled. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. The city of Austin would never be the same. Within hours, the yogurt shop transformed from a fire scene into a crime scene. But from the very beginning, something critical slipped through the cracks. A chived quote from one of the former investigator. There were too many people inside. Fire crews. Patrol officers. Detectives. It wasn't controlled. Evidence got trampled before we even knew what we had. Shell casings. Footprints. Biological material. All at risk. Some of it lost forever. A bullet found at the scene disappeared. A key piece of evidence, gone without explanation. Instead of sealing the building, officers walked in and out. No gloves. No protective gear. Photos were taken, but not enough. Angles were missed. Bodies were moved before forensic mapping. In a statement made in one of the firefighter recollection, one of the girls still had a pulse when we arrived. But we weren't told to treat it as a crime scene. We just tried to work fast. Nobody thought someone might still be alive in there. That survivor was Amy Ayers. Shot twice, once in the back of the head, but still breathing when help arrived. She died shortly after. Multiple witnesses reported seeing strange men around the shop before closing. One female witness recalling says, "There were 2 guys inside, sitting without food. Just staring. I told my boyfriend it felt wrong." Their descriptions were taken, then buried in paperwork. Their names? Never entered into evidence logs. A local resident recounts. People started double-locking doors. Parents stopped letting kids work late shifts. The whole community froze. Media stations called it the worst crime in Austin history. But the investigation was already slipping out of control. Hours after the fire was reported, handwritten statements were collected. But some went missing. Others were misdated. And a crucial note, referencing 2 unidentified males spotted behind the store, was accidentally discarded. Archived observations shows how frustrated detectives became. We were chasing ghosts in a burning maze. And someone kept moving the doors. Mother of Sarah and Jennifer Harbison narrates that, "They kept telling us to be patient. I wanted to know who killed my girls, not sit quietly and wait for a miracle." Weeks passed. No arrests. No suspects named publicly. The families watched hope drip away, one unanswered question at a time. But what no one knew then, what no one was supposed to know, is that someone at the scene that night should have been questioned immediately. And that man was allowed to walk away. Months passed. Then years. Austin demanded justice. Detectives needed suspects, and they found two. But not because the evidence led them there. Robert Springsteen was 17 at the time of the murders. Michael Scott was just 15. They were teenagers, boys who hung out downtown and got into minor trouble. Nothing tied them to the yogurt shop. No DNA. No fingerprints. No witnesses. But police needed a break, and so they made one. In a frank comment, a former FBI profiler says, "There are cases where detectives chase answers, and cases where they shape them. This one was shaped." In 1999, 8 years after the murders, Springsteen and Scott were questioned. What began as interviews became psychological sieges. 4 hours. Then days. Then weeks. Each was told the other had already confessed. Each was told denial meant life in prison, or worse. Eventually, they broke. Scott confessed first. His words fractured, uncertain, contradicting physical evidence. He said things that didn't match the crime scene. But detectives didn't care. Scott narrates that. "They told me I must have been there. I just said what they wanted." Then came Springsteen. His confession placed him at the scene, but his story didn't line up either. There were no details only a killer could know. Just statements detectives led him into repeating. In 2001, Robert Springsteen was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. In 2002, Michael Scott was sentenced to life in prison. In the courtroom, the presiding judge rules. The jury finds the defendant guilty as charged. A family member recalls after the judgment that, "We thought, maybe this was it. Maybe we could finally breathe." Neither confession mentioned the girls being bound. Neither mentioned the gunshots. Neither explained the fire accelerant. And then, DNA testing advanced. In 2008, biological evidence from the scene, sperm DNA, was tested. It didn't match Springsteen. It didn't match Scott. It didn't match any of the 4 girls. The state's entire case has now collapsed. Their convictions were overturned. They were released. And once again, the real killers were still out there. Expressing disappointment, Eliza's father says, "They told us they had the men who did it. Now we're back at zero. How do you start grieving all over again?" But the deepest wound wasn't just that the wrong men were arrested. While detectives pushed 2 teenagers into false confessions, the real trail sat in plain sight, ignored, redacted, or erased. On the night of December 6th, multiple people reported seeing strange men near the shop, men who didn't belong, men whose names never made it to court. Witness number 1 recalling, "I saw 2 guys hanging outside the shop near closing time. They weren't kids. One had a military haircut. I told police that night." Her statement never entered into official evidence. Witness number 2. "There was a man sitting in a parked car behind the building with the lights off. I thought it was weird." His report vanished too. Some witnesses mentioned 2 Hispanic men. Others described a taller white man with long hair. One clerk across the street mentioned a man in a green jacket pacing outside around closing time. Former detective recalls that there were at least 3 possible suspects mentioned early. None were brought back in. None were followed up on. It's not just what investigators missed, it's what they ignored. An off-shift employee, Forrest Wellborn, was questioned early on. He was 16. He was with the girls the night before. Some detectives pushed him, but no physical evidence tied him to the scene. He was dropped quietly. But one name changed everything when it resurfaced decades later. A man spotted by multiple witnesses, yet never interviewed. His name was quietly scrubbed from reports. His initials appear in early notes, then disappear by the next draft. When the defense asked about him years later, he simply wasn't on file. Keep watching to know the mystery behind a forgotten photograph and the man behind the mask. Don't forget to subscribe, hype this video, share, like, and comment. By doing so, you stand for justice. If you've done so, congrats. Injustice tolerated in one case breeds others around. Someone made sure he didn't exist on paper. In the 2010s, a forgotten photograph came back into circulation. Two men outside the yogurt shop that night. One described. One never mentioned. The second figure, a blurred face in the background, didn't match Springsteen. Didn't match Scott. Didn't match any known witness. That image went unlogged. It was in a box marked unrelated. But what if it wasn't unrelated? What if it was inconvenient? Evidence was mislabeled. Notes were lost. The bullet that killed one of the girls? It vanished before ballistics testing. There were people we were told not to bother. People higher up didn't want certain names on record. So, who were these men? And who wanted them forgotten? In Bob Ayres, Amy's fathers. Don't tell me it was sloppy work. Tell me who told you to stop looking at those men. Pam Thomas, Eliza's mother, insinuates. If they had followed every lead, my daughter might have justice today. 30 years later, whispers return. Private investigators start digging. Retired officers talk off the record. A name is spoken again, the name crossed out in the 90s. And that name leads to a man with a violent past, a history of arson, and connections that could make certain people very nervous. But this man was never booked, never swabbed, never even questioned. If he wasn't a suspect, was he being protected? And if so, by who? Because someone made sure the wrong men were blamed, and that the right one walked away. To understand why justice failed, we have to go back to the crime scene itself, where truth was lost before sunrise. Firefighters arrived fast, but by the time arson investigators stepped in, the scene was already trampled by first responders, officers, and confused onlookers. In a reflective and regretful tone, a former fire investigator recounts that there were firefighters walking through puddles of melted ceiling, police stepping near the bodies. Nobody knew who was securing what. We weren't trained for something like this. Heat damage destroyed fingerprints. Bullet fragments were swept up and mislabeled. Blood evidence, charred, fused, and lost. One bullet was recovered from one of the girls. It disappeared before analysis. We logged it. Months later, it wasn't in evidence. Just gone. The families were never told. Documents tied to early suspects? Missing. Statements from bystanders? Gone. We know certain names were in the initial reports. But those names vanish by the time indictments happen. That's not incompetence, that's intent. Even the FBI, brought in for profiling, noted inconsistencies. But their recommendations? Never followed. In 1999, nearly a decade after the murders, the families were told the case was finally solved. They were assured the men in custody, Springsteen and Scott, were guilty. Amy's sister in an emotional tone notes that, "We wanted to believe them. We needed to, but cracks appeared fast. There was no physical evidence tying the men to the scene. No fingerprints. No recovered weapons. No matching DNA." Culled from the court excerpt. Mr. Springsteen's statement was obtained after over 12 hours of interrogation. Michael Scott confessed only after being shown diagrams and told to imagine the crime. His words were fed to him. Despite the lack of evidence, Travis County prosecutors built their case around confessions. The public, starved for answers, trusted them. The prosecutor in his wisdom laments that this community needs closure. The families deserve justice. 2 convictions followed. But the truth was already unraveling. In 2008, new DNA testing pulled a profile off one of the victims. It wasn't Springsteen. It wasn't Scott. The DNA report clearly states that The unidentified male DNA does not match either defendant. Convictions collapsed. The charges were dropped. The wrong men were held for nearly a decade. But instead of reopening the case fully, instead of chasing the unknown DNA, everything slowed. Files were sealed. Evidence stayed in storage. And the man whose name vanished from early reports? Still free. Even Bob Ayers sensed the inconsistencies and controversies surrounding the case. For him, Amy's father. They told us justice was done. Now they're telling us it never was. For Pam Thomas, Eliza's mother. They promised us the truth. They gave us excuses. And one father said the quietest, most haunting thing of all. A grieving parent says, "I think they know who did it. I think they always knew." Because buried evidence doesn't disappear, it waits. And when it comes back, it exposes not just a killer, but a cover-up. To understand what was ignored in 1991, we have to go back to the hours before the fire. That evening, customers remembered seeing two men inside the shop around closing time. In the statement of the witness, they were acting strange. One followed the girls to the back. "I told the police. They wrote something down. I never heard back." Her report? Not in official files today. There's no record of any follow-up. No sketches. No descriptions released to the public. A man who ordered yogurt hours before the fire saw someone lurking outside by the dumpsters. He described him, tall, dark jacket, pacing. He reported it that same night. That description never appeared in trial documents. No alert was ever issued. That man was never found. Years later, a former officer quietly admitted that one individual was mentioned early on. A man known to local authorities. Someone with a history of violence. An anonymous former officer recounts. "We had a name. But after the first week, it was gone from everything. Didn't make sense then. Doesn't make sense now." When asked for paperwork, there was none. Reports from those first days were missing, or said to have never existed. Then, in the mid-2000s, a photo surfaced. It showed two silhouetted men outside the shop close to closing time. One was identifiable, the other wasn't in any file. When we showed the image to one of the original witnesses, she said, "That's one of them. He was inside." She said no one had ever shown her that photo before. The photo was never entered into evidence. The public never saw it. The unidentified male DNA found years later didn't match Springsteen or Scott. Investigators tested dozens of men, but not all the early names. Especially not the one that vanished from reports. They never tested everyone they should have. They never released the full list of names. And if that name was tied to someone with influence? Someone protected? Then silence wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. When the convictions against Springsteen and Scott collapsed, the families asked the one question no one wanted to hear. In an emotion tone, Jennifer's father questions. If it's not them, then who is it? Who was there that night? Whose DNA is that? The answer, even now, remains sealed in silence. But the unnamed man? He didn't disappear. His life went on. His records exist. And when one investigator tried to follow that trail, someone made sure it went dark. Continue watching for you're about to encounter where the cover-up stops being a theory and becomes a map. Now, the cover-up nobody admitted, were they? Suppressed leads, altered files, protection, or negligence? By the early 2000s, the yogurt shop case was already fractured, but when old files were reviewed, something far more troubling emerged. Two independent reviewers, one a retired detective, one a legal researcher, compared the original case files to what remained in official archives. Entire reports weren't there. Statements we knew existed couldn't be found. One witness list was missing 4 names. Not misplaced. Gone. And not by accident. One of the missing names was tied to a man with a violent past. He'd been seen near the strip mall multiple times. He'd been arrested before. And police spoke to him briefly, then never again. A former investigator recalls that. He wasn't in the logs. It's like the conversation never took place. But several of us remember it. His DNA was never tested. His associates were never interviewed. His alibi? Never documented. Years after the initial investigation, a private citizen received unofficial access to a mislabeled box of old evidence documents. According to this witness advocate, inside were notes, handwritten, referencing two men seen entering after closing. Those notes were not in the official database. When copies were requested, the box disappeared. No record it was ever logged in. In 1992, an anonymous call came in naming two suspects, one matching the man from the missing files. The call was logged by a dispatcher, but there's no written follow-up, no transcript, no officer assigned. The family never heard about it. The public never learned of it. Until years later, when a journalist found a reference in a leftover memo. One retired detective, whose name we've been asked not to share, claimed he was told to drop a thread that pointed toward a known individual. Whether it was incompetence, intimidation, or intentional cover-up, the outcome was the same. The wrong leads got priority, and the right ones vanished. By this point, the Harbison, Ayers, and Thomas families had stopped trusting official statements. They started digging on their own, pressing for names, documents, anything. One of the family member firmly asserts that, "We weren't just fighting for answers. We were fighting what someone refused to say out loud." But the silence didn't hold forever. One investigator, years later, reopened a door that someone thought was sealed shut. And that door led back to the man everyone forgot. This is where the shadows finally turn, and a name that disappeared comes back to life. For nearly 2 decades, one man's name stayed off official reports. Not arrested. Not questioned. Not tested. But time has a way of unearthing what some hoped would stay buried. In the late 2000s, a cold case investigator, brought in after the exonerations, reviewed early statements. He found an old note with a first name scribbled beside a description of 2 men at closing time. In the words of the cold case detective, "I checked the digital logs. That name wasn't in there. It wasn't anywhere. But multiple witnesses mentioned 2 men. So why was only one recorded?" The photograph, taken by a bystander just minutes before smoke was seen, had never been entered into evidence. It wasn't in the case index. It appeared only after a private investigator found a personal copy. But the man in that photo had a record. He'd been arrested in Austin before. He'd done time. He was known to authorities. The unidentified male DNA found on a victim's clothing still doesn't match anyone in Cody's. Whispers from one of the former lab tech reveals that not everyone from the early suspect pool was tested. Some samples weren't collected. Others were not prioritized. And the man in that missing file? Never swabbed. Not once. Else you forget, subscribe to Shadowlens for more untold true crime stories, where silence is never permanent, and justice waits in the shadows. Already done so, thank you. You're a voice of change that demands accountability, responsibility, and justice, to make the world a better place. When Jennifer and Sarah Harbison's mother was told about the photo and the forgotten suspect, she didn't speak for nearly a minute. In her mother's words, "You're telling me this man was there, and no one checked him? No one told us? How do you live with that?" The cold case detective who tried to follow the lead was abruptly reassigned. He was never told why. His access to specific files was revoked. His digital requests? Marked unavailable. Even the detective acknowledged off record that, when you touch certain names in old cases, doors close from the inside. I've seen it before, but not like this. But secrets don't stay sealed forever. Because someone else had seen that man before, and he wasn't alone that night. Essentially, we gotten to where a forgotten voice speaks, and the story takes a turn the case was never meant to survive. For years, statements were dismissed as unreliable, too young, too vague, too late. But memory has weight, especially when tied to trauma. A man in his 40s, who was a teenage employee at a nearby shop in 1991, finally agreed to speak with a private investigator. Former mall worker reveals, "Back then I told an officer I saw two guys behind the yogurt shop after closing. One was messing with the back door. The other was keeping watch. The cop wrote it down. I never heard back." When shown the resurfaced photo, he pointed without hesitation. Firmly the witness continued, "That's the one near the back door. The other guy stood closer to the dumpster. I remember his jacket, dark, heavy, like work gear." Authorities focused on only one male silhouette over the years. But this witness confirmed a second man, never identified, never questioned, never recorded by name. Two men were there that night. Not boys. Not teens. Adults. And neither matched the men who were arrested years later. What this witness described reshapes the final hour of the girls' lives. Two unidentified adult males lingering behind the shop, minutes before the fire. If investigators had followed that thread, the case would have taken a completely different path. When the witness's statement resurfaced, a victim's family member was allowed to hear it. In a mood of devastation, a relative of Amy Ayres says, "So you're saying they were seen before it happened? They were right there? And no one told us?" She wasn't angry at the witness. She was angry at the silence that followed him. Privately, another retired officer acknowledged hearing early reports of two older males behind the shop around closing. According to the officer, "We had a unit check the area, but nothing came of it. I don't know why the call never made it into the main files. Things got lost or removed." The re-emergence of the first overlooked suspect triggered renewed interest. His name came up again, from someone who knew him back then. Another off-the-record witness accounts that he used to hang around that strip. He was weird around girls. Always broke. Always angry. When the fire happened, he stopped coming by. Not speculation. Not rumor. A concrete recollection, never presented to a grand jury, never included in public files. And here is where everything breaks open, because someone else, someone very close to the case, admits they were told not to connect that name to the scene. What we're about to see shortly isn't about what was forgotten, it's about what was hidden. Names resurface, protection or neglect to lead buried on purpose. For 30 years, one name kept surfacing quietly, whispered by former officers, hinted at in redacted notes, recalled by people from the neighborhood. A man who was there, but never questioned. When investigators revisited old witness logs, one private researcher noticed a gap, an entry number missing from a list of early interviews. The name originally attached to that entry? It belonged to a man who lived less than a mile away. Someone with documented violence in his past. Someone seen with another man near the strip mall that same year. In the words of the private investigator, not only was he never interrogated, his name doesn't even appear in the official discovery files. A family member of this unnamed man was approached decades later. One retired officer, speaking off record, admitted this man's name was mentioned in early chatter at the department. For the retired officer, there was a note about him. A tip that came in. But someone said to leave it alone. I don't know why, or maybe I do. Some cases aren't mishandled, they're muted. Speculation turned to suspicion when it was discovered that this man had a relative in local government at the time, someone with influence. Someone who could make files vanish. Several names of potential persons of interest disappeared. But his? It was erased entirely. Witnesses remembered a second man that night, older, taller, carrying something bulky beneath his jacket. Police sketches were never made, even after multiple accounts. Reaffirming this, a former employee witness states. Two of them. One near the dumpster. One closer to the back door. They weren't kids. Decades later, an undeveloped roll of film kept by a teenager who snapped photos from across the parking lot was processed by his son. The image? Two men standing in the alley. When shown side by side with the name that vanished from files, multiple people recognized him. Without hesitation, a witness pointed. "That's him. That's the same man I saw that night." Despite this identification, law enforcement made no move. No renewed press conference. No search. Nothing. In total disappointment, a family member of victim laments. So his name was there. People saw him. Evidence pointed to him. And they just walked past it? Was this failure, or was it protection? Subsequently, you'll see how far someone went to keep him untouchable, and what happened to the one investigator who refused to drop his name. One man inside the system refused to let the missing name stay buried. He wasn't a headline detective, just a persistent one. His curiosity would cost him everything. Detective Mark Reynolds, assigned briefly to the Cold Case Review in the early 2000s, stumbled across a redacted note that mentioned the unnamed man. He requested the unedited file, a coworker recounting what transpired years later. He noted that Detective Mark Reynolds questioned, why was he never interviewed? This doesn't add up. He started digging, calling old witnesses, tracking employment history, the usual. Then suddenly, he was told to stop. Within weeks, Reynolds received a quiet message from a superior. It was calm but chilling, giving him a directive. Focus on viable leads. Don't get stuck chasing ghosts that were cleared for a reason. But the man had never been cleared. Because he was never checked at all. Reynolds filed a formal request for archived documents tied to that name. When the box arrived, it was nearly empty. The index sheet listed 7 items. Only one remained. A retired records clerk in a weighted regret recounts. "We didn't lose that paperwork. Someone removed it. I don't know who, but I know it was deliberate." According to his wife, a dark sedan began parking across the street late at night. Months later, Reynolds resigned without explanation. His final cold case memo was only 3 lines long. Lead was present. Lead was ignored. Lead remains dangerous. A former colleague of his inquired about his decision to resign and reveals, "When I pressed him about it, he said, if I push this any further, my career won't be the only thing gone." Reynolds moved out of state, changed departments, and has spoken only once about the case, off the record. But before he left Austin, for decades, no official record mentioned this man. No interview logs. No suspect notes. No follow-ups. Yet multiple witnesses remembered him, and one investigator risked everything to document his existence. Reynolds compared the original 1991 witness list to the updated one in the Cold Case Review. One name that appeared in the earliest handwritten notes vanished in the digitized version. It was Robert Eugene Brasher's. Former cold case tech clearly states off the record. Those edits weren't random. Someone sanitized the record. Why wasn't Robert Eugene Brasher's questioned? Why did his name vanish? Why was he later observed leaving the state just days after the murders? An anonymous ex-investigator who chose anonymity recalls that there was a quiet instruction back then, don't chase that trail. People assumed it was about jurisdiction. It wasn't. 1 year before the murders, Robert Eugene Brasher's was arrested in another county for trespassing into a closed business after hours. The charge vanished before arraignment. No conviction. No paper trail. Someone wiped it clean. Records suggest he relocated twice, changed work fields, and was briefly tied to a subcontractor connected to private security. He has never been officially named, questioned, or cleared. A true crime researcher asserts. Everything points to him, but everything about him is missing. That's not coincidence. That's concealment. The cover-up didn't begin after the murders. It began the night they happened. In other words, narrow the lens, fast. Push one angle. Ignore another. The same name wiped from witness notes. The same man seen near the shop. The same man who never appeared anywhere in the official suspect pool. Not everyone who walks onto a crime scene is official. Sometimes, they're already there, before the police arrive. In 2025, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. DNA testing linked Robert Eugene Brasher's, a known serial killer who died in 1999, to the murders. A bullet casing found at the scene matched the gun used in Brasher's suicide. Brasher's had a history of violent crimes across multiple states. Yet, he was never a suspect in the yogurt shop murders until now. His connection to the case raises more questions than answers. For over 3 decades, the families of Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah lived with the pain of not knowing the truth. The recent revelation brought a mix of relief and renewed grief. This case teaches us the importance of justice, the dangers of coerced confessions, and the power of modern forensic science. The pursuit of truth is not just about solving crimes, it's about honoring the victims and ensuring their stories are told. While Brasher's is no longer alive to face justice, the fight continues. Investigators and the community are determined to ensure that all victims receive the justice they deserve. The case may be closed, but the journey for justice is far from over. The yogurt shop murders case is a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring strength of those who seek justice. Thank you for watching. Remember, the pursuit of truth is a journey, not a destination. Injustice ignored doesn't vanish, it multiplies. Subscribe to Shadowlens so these stories aren't buried. If you're already with us, you're not just watching, you're one of the unwavering voices pushing the world toward truth.